Um, Thank you very much, Camille, for that very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to the publicity that he's offered here. I'm very honored to be asked to present a lecture named for Professor Tony Atkinson. Tony Atkinson actually taught me when I was an undergraduate, and he was a very young assistant professor at Cambridge. I always remember him presenting crossing Lorenz curves and, befuddling his innocent audience about how you would judge two different distributions of income if the Lorenz curves crossed. He is well known to have wanted to keep the work going, the work that he'd founded on poverty and inequality. And he's always said to have been very good at encouraging people to share. And I have a personal testimony on this point too, because after some garden party in Oxford, my husband had a conversation with Tony, and later on I was sent into the crawl space in our attic to rescue some data from the Guatemalan financial sector that my husband had put together in the 1960s that he wanted to share with Tony Atkinson. And I should say, by the way, that this wasn't, just a patriarchal order to crawl into the space under the roof, but he's 6 feet something or other, and I, as you see, I'm 5 feet something or other, and I come from generations of coal miners. So this was actually, second nature to me. And we did share the data with Tony Atkinson. So I do then have these personal ties, and I'm very happy to give the lecture. But what I want to talk about tonight is a different kind of inequality. This is a set of responses to a question given in this 2021 census. And you can see here, this is a very narrow definition of caring labor built in here. You have to have helped somebody with a long-term disability, inability to manage everyday tasks themselves. And the census then recorded something like 5.8 million unpaid carers in the UK today. That's about 1 in 8 people. And they're not providing very brief amounts of care either. They're providing many hours every week. And according to the Centre for Care, they save the British economy something like 184 billion pounds. Now, according to my estimates, that's about 7% of GDP. So this is not trivial stuff. And the census also found that women do the majority of this unpaid care. But caring labor, of course, is a lot more than this account given in the census. It involves childcare, elder care, care of the disabled, and people who cannot manage everyday tasks, as was discovered in the census. But it also includes domestic labor, housework, and emotional support. And I would argue, along with many feminist economists, that this represents the underpinning of the economic system. This really is the set of tasks that deal with social reproduction from day to day and generation to generation. And it's disproportionately done by women, paid and unpaid. And feminist economists have long argued that this is wrong. It's unjust. It entrenches wider inequalities because the care burden disadvantages women when they do enter the labor market, because they are regarded as having their priorities elsewhere, and therefore employers penalize them in terms of promotion, pay, and so on. A point that Claudia Goldin makes very emphatically in her Career and Family. And it's not simply the time that you actually actively spend providing care, it's also supervisory care. So it's also just being on call, as Claudia emphasized. So this care burden extends into the labour market then, and it stretches across borders as well, because of course there's been a huge reliance on migrant labour. This is the feminisation of migration to work in the care sectors in advanced economies. But it's not simply a question of injustice. The contributions of the value of care, of unpaid care, are missing from gross domestic product. They're not counted in the way in which we count economic activity. And the people who do it are generally viewed as being economically inactive. They're outside the labour force. And this is despite unpaid care generating this significant value that I talked about a minute ago. And I would argue, along with many feminist economists, that this omission has created blind spots. It creates a blind spot about well-being. This huge contribution to well-being is ignored. The social costs of reproduction are treated as private costs, not as individual costs, not as collective responsibilities. And structural inequalities across gender, class, and ethnicity and race, of course, generations are obscured. And I also argue that productivity and growth are highly likely to be mismeasured as a result of this. So these blind spots matter. They matter for public policy, and they matter for evaluation of progress, whether this is measured in terms of economic performance or social equity or overall well-being. And currently there is increasing interest in the care sector. So this slide shows you two very recent contributions. In the center of the slide is the front piece of the latest Review of Economic Policy, the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, which has a double special issue on the care economy. Some contributors are in fact in the audience here tonight. A very good read if you're interested in the topic. If I don't completely dull your interest in this topic, you can go away and look at that special issue. There's also a new book coming out, edited by Jill Rubery and some of her colleagues, that points out how the crisis in the care sector, which is caused by demographic change as well as new limitations on immigration, that is in fact overlaps many of the other crises in the economy today. So early social scientists recognized that domestic labor, both indirect care, that is housework, and direct care, that is the kind of care that the census was interested in, was socially productive. But lost sight of this in many of their arguments. I've just been at a conference in Cambridge about Adam Smith, because The Wealth of Nations is now 250 years old, the founding book of our discipline. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith recognizes the value of social reproduction, but then he gets distracted by how interesting the marketplace is and how monetary exchange is really important. And so he completely starts to forget about the value of women's work in the household. And by the 20th century, production and consumption really monopolized economists' interests. And self-interest was in fact viewed as the primary economic motive, forgetting Adam Smith paying great attention to women's work in the home. And perhaps Adam Smith noticed himself that this was not motivated by the same kinds of self-interest that motivated his apocryphal butcher and baker, but was motivated by other kinds of emotions. This ignoring of caring labor is reinforced by the way in which the standard national accounting system fails to include unpaid work in the home. And creation of a production boundary so that tasks that aren't monetized by market exchange are excluded from GDP and not counted in national accounts. In the 1990s, there was some reform to the national accounting system, which urged statistical authorities to set up what they refer to as satellite accounts that could include other kinds of activities, including housework, but these were still then excluded from national income accounting proper. And that means they're excluded very often from policy decisions, of course. Let me emphasize too that this is not a trivial issue, because in fact, many of the valuations, the monetization of unpaid care really are very significant. So Benjamin Bridgman, in the issue of the OXREP that I told you about, he estimates that if you in fact count unpaid care in the US economy, it's about a third of the US GDP. So this is really a very significant contribution. And time use studies show that globally, the amount of time that people spend on unpaid care worldwide is really very significant. Excluding unpaid care distorts levels of GDP because when market work is actually commercialized, it moves across that production boundary and becomes counted. And the opposite, when in fact, market work is familiarized, is sent back into the family. This is famously this point was famously made by Pigou when he said, well, if I marry my housekeeper, GDP will fall, national income will fall. And of course, she is providing the same services. Presumably, she's providing additional services when she's his wife. But nonetheless, we get this weird, conceptually indefensible change. And Colin Clark, in several really interesting but long forgotten papers, argues that the boom that followed World War II, in fact, should be shaded down because a lot of that boom was work being transferred from the family into the market. And so what was being gained in the market was being lost in the household. And that was a result of women's mass movement into the labor market after World War II. And my co-author, Lou Henderson, and I have argued that, in fact, when breastfeeding is commercialized, in fact, to move away from breastfeeding to purchasing formula, for example, GDP will rise, even though we know that the market substitute is, in fact, not as qualitatively, not as valuable as the source that is lost. So this kind of movement of activities across the production boundary, across the exchange frontier, distorts levels and inter-period comparisons of growth rates in economic life. So let's think about some conceptual foundations to restore respect for care then. And I think feminist economists have argued that care is provided by families, communities, the state, and the market. And it moves within this care diamond over time as various different providers provide the care as economies develop. Care is foundational. It underpins the rest of economic life. It underpins Smith's market system. Individuals benefit, but there are huge externalities in the provision of care. And this means, of course, that markets are going to under-provide care services. Care's relational, and so it can't be scaled up indefinitely. And that leads to the care gap, as it's called today, where, in fact, demand for care is outrunning supply. People argue that care is actually not recurrent consumption, but is in fact investment. This is a point made by Susan Himmelwaite, for example. So I want to use economic history. So now we're going to have to go in a time traveling machine and go back in time, because I'm going to use economic history to reposition care. And I'm going to use a historical perspective to highlight the value of caring labor and underline the dangers involved in its neglect. Okay, so valuing care historically involves monetizing it. We can't get away from this. Economists will say, well, if you tell them a qualitative story, they want to know the numbers, the amount, the monetary value. So that's where we might start. It's not where we want to stop, but it's where we might start. And there are a variety of well-known methodologies for valuing care. We can use the opportunity cost approach, which is in the top little calculation on the right-hand side here, where in fact we value the care that's being given according to the market wage that the carer would get if she were to enter the labor market. Or we can use replacement costs. That is, we can value the care that's being provided by what it would cost to buy somebody from the market to provide that care. Or we can value the care according to the cost of market equivalents themselves. So buying some kind of commodity versions of care directly from the market. To turn these kinds of stories into historical numbers is very difficult because we don't know much about the extent of unpaid services in the past quantitatively. If we're trying to value these services using women's wages, we run the difficulty that if we believe there's discrimination in the labor market, or there are social norms that prevent women's wages from rising in line with demand, for example, that in fact we will be systematically underestimating the value of care. And as is taken up, another point taken up in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy special issue, time use is really a very difficult issue. Economists will say to feminists, how much time was being spent on childcare in the past? How much time was spent cleaning in the house? And since we don't know these time budgets, even for modern societies, this, of course, is very difficult to conceptualize in historical contexts. We also need to historicize care. It's not the same in all times and places. It involves different tasks historically. You only need to, think about what life was like living in the houses of the past before you're immediately confronted with the fact that housework is an activity that changes its nature. And we also have issues here because women's work is so badly documented in the past, because women didn't have occupations that could be in fact be counted in censuses. They didn't do things like butchery or baking or building. They in fact made shift in their households. They did lots of different things when the opportunities arose. So it's very difficult to look at women's work historically. So here's a list of indirect care activities. By indirect care, I mean housework type activities that women did in the past. And I put this together by looking at actually what women were doing, what people said ordinary housewives should be doing, and what appears in advice books and what appears in ordinary people's accounts of everyday life. And you can see here that there are some activities that you might think, well, that's a bit weird. I didn't think of that as being part of housework. Particularly, and we're going to come back to this, enabling elimination. That is emptying and cleaning and changing chamber pots, hands in closed stools. They're like chamber pots that are hidden away in a cupboard. And cleaning outhouses and these kinds of activities. this kind of activity is well understood as being part of women's repertoire of tasks in poor countries today in the global south. I mean, if you look at the WASH analyses of women's role in households in the global south, you'll find lots of discussion of sanitation, hygiene provision, water supplies, and so on. So this list of tasks really takes us not just into the past, but it also takes us into poor countries today. Also, the content of direct care changes in the past. Most mothers wouldn't today contemplate pulling out their children's teeth. But that was widely practiced. I got all kinds of evidence from individual life accounts in historic Britain of people pulling teeth out, for example. So domestic labor in the past then had a wider range of tasks than it does today. And there is one other way in which we might try and get at the value of domestic labor in the past. And this was noticed by two of the most well-known commentators on the value of unpaid work, Colin Clark and Margaret Reed. But Margaret Reed dropped the idea completely. She says here, another method suggested is to look at the costs of board and lodging. But she drops the idea. She says lifestyles were so different for individuals who were boarding and lodging compared with independent households. And she doesn't pursue it further. Whereas Colin Clark actually does in Oxford Review of Statistics, he actually has a lovely paper in 1958 where he actually tries to use this approach to value unpaid work in England and Wales in those years. And by the way, it comes to some enormous figure when he's done his computations. So you can then look at the costs of maintenance, including the costs of domestic service that is needed for people's upkeep, that is necessary to, in fact, maintain people. And this is the approach that I took in a recent piece of research. And I, in fact, collected over 45,000 historical estimates of what it cost to support an individual person and how those costs included the costs of domestic service, as well as the raw materials like the foodstuffs and the beds and so on, that to add to those material costs, the costs of this essential service. So there's a variety of ways in which our historical documents record these costs of maintenance. People supported, people put up their workers, and they recorded the costs of maintaining their workers in their accounts. So you get a lot of evidence from account books. Old people very often gave their land and their property to their children in exchange for their children maintaining them. And they recorded what this bargain would look like. Sometimes the costs of boarding kin are turned into pensions. And so we can actually see again the monetary value of maintenance costs. You know, I am kind of like a historian, even if I'm not really a proper historian. So I can't resist showing you some actual documents. So this is an agreement made by the pastor of the Cornish Methodist Circuit with a woman called Mrs. Amelia Thomas. She's illiterate, so she signs there with a cross, you can see. But she's agreeing to provide domestic service and food and so on, but turning those foodstuffs into meals, turning those bed linens into comfy made-up beds for the young preachers as they pass through the Cornish Methodist circuit. And this is one that I really love. This is an agreement between a widow, Anne Donne, who lives in Shropshire. And I found this in the Shropshire Archive. And she's doing a deal with her son. She says, okay, look, I'll give you my land, and you don't have to pay the whole market rent. I will make a little reduction for you. And she lists what is required in this agreement. She lists what he is supposed to provide her as a result of her allowing him this rebate on the market rent. And she says things like, I want my room to have a chimney. That means she can have a fire in her own room. And the servant or Henry himself has to bring that. So she is being serviced domestically in this estimate of her provision that she's demanding. So having gathered all this information on what it costs to maintain ordinary people, I then used regression analysis to tease out of this the specific costs of domestic labor, the work that was needed to turn commodities into upkeep, to turn the food, the raw material, the food and the thread and the cloth into clothing, into meals being provided, and so on. And this, of course, relates to the maintenance of single adults, but you can easily scale this up for family provision. And it's based on market prices, and you might say, well, the market was providing a service that is not the same as what is provided in the household. This is what put Margaret Reed off this kind of approach. But in fact, you could then maybe decide whether you think the service would be less and shade down what the market signal is. You might also say, well, how many households were dependent on unpaid workers not buying domestic labor from the market? And I take this from Bob Allen's account of how many households, the proportion of all households that didn't have any servants. And we can then impute the total value of these household services by multiplying the value for individual households across all households that needed unpaid care, that weren't buying it from the market, didn't have servants, and then relate that to GDP. And this is the answer to this question of how valuable was housework in the past, because it looks like it was more than a quarter of historical GDP in many time periods. It really was, again, boosting the equivalent of GDP, that all household incomes added together. So for these particular dates, I can actually look at the relative importance monetarily of domestic work. And it's a quarter of total income. But let's reflect a little bit on the value of housework here. Because in that housework, there is lots of tasks that have significant externalities that really don't only benefit the individual receivers of the care, but which have diffuse effects right across the economy. And enabling elimination that I pointed out was a task very, very frequently mentioned and discussed in historical sources, is actually a really vital activity in terms of sanitation, hygiene, and health. And women's work here in enabling elimination means that there is a move away from open defecation, which again, the FAO, the UN, UNICEF all say is a massively important health advantage. So WASH, for example, estimates that any investment in the elimination of open defecation as having a 500% rate of return. But now I want to use the rest of my time to turn back to direct care. So this is the personal care services that are provided to individuals. And I'm going to pick up on one of the tasks that I listed in direct care that, again, you might be rather unfamiliar with in terms of talking about caring work, and that is breastfeeding. And this work is with Lou Henderson, so all the hard questions I will, of course, immediately refer to him. Well, first of all, one of our reviewers says, "What, is breastfeeding work?" Huh. You know, well, it's certainly onerous. There's a very nice paper by Alexandra Shepherd, who is a genuine historian, where she has gathered lots of material and showing how in the past women were always complaining about how exhausting breastfeeding was. Anybody who's breastfed will agree that it is very exhausting. It uses calories between 500 and 700 calories per day, according to FAO. And it crosses that production boundary from unpaid work into the market. So in the past, people could hire wet nurses if they had enough money, of course. So wet nurses could substitute from mother's own maternal nursing. And later on, of course, they could buy formula. Somewhere in between, they could buy all kinds of unsuitable things with which they fed their luckless infants. So it crosses the production boundary. So it's a very interesting activity in that way. Of course, it's got massive, significant health and well-being effects for the individuals that are involved here. It improves infant survival, particularly in historical contexts where sanitation may be bad, where housing may be overcrowded, water supplies may be contaminated, milk may be infected with tuberculosis, and so on. So it improves infant survival. And it supports long-term health of mothers and babies. And there's an externality coming in because it improves the productivity of those children when they grow up to become workers. And it even, according to some recent research, enhances cognitive development. So lots of longer-term external effects involved here. It also suppresses fertility via lactational amenorrhea. And this was one reason why the elite in Britain used wet nurses, because they were anxious to, in fact, have more babies, and why, in fact, relatively poor people might have breastfed for longer because they wanted to have fewer babies. There is evidence, if you're interested, if you're a history buff, you know, there's evidence that Anne Boleyn wanted to breastfeed Elizabeth I, but she was told that was definitely off the cards because the most important thing was to give Henry another baby as quickly as possible, and most importantly, a baby who was a male. So she didn't breastfeed little Elizabeth. She was breastfed by the royal wet nurse. Breastfeeding, I want you to try and think of it as substituting for public infrastructure, if in fact it is actually substituting for poor quality milk, for bad water, for dilapidated housing. Well, Lou Henderson and I, this work is with Louis Henderson, and we identify the prevalence of breastfeeding according to two basic identities. First of all, well, we identify the value as being equivalent to the prevalence of breastfeeding times by its unit value. And we identify the prevalence as being the same as the product of incidence, that is the numbers of babies who potentially need breastfeeding, and most importantly here, the duration, how long these babies are breastfed for. because that obviously affects the prevalence at any one point in time of breastfeeding. So that's what's said on the right-hand side of your screen here. And let me emphasize that breastfeeding is not a biological given. It varies widely across time and space. But it really is something that is a decision variable in here. And it's governed particularly by duration. This is why I underlined the importance of duration here. How long babies are breastfed for, what age are they weaned at? This breastfeeding has been paid no attention by economists, absolutely no attention, and by economic historians who follow in economists' footsteps very often, rather too often for my taste. That's an aside. And there's been very little attempt to value breastfeeding. There is an Australian feminist economist who's worked very hard for many years on this topic, and I cited some of her work here. But it's historically vital. Unless babies were breastfed for long periods of history, they died. There was no alternative to breastfeeding, and very few people could afford to buy a wet nurse. So Lou and I have been reading some horrific accounts of what babies were fed on when there was no breastfeeding alternative. The economic determinants of breastfeeding are very important. There are income effects. The incidence of breastfeeding is higher in low-income countries. Cross-sectional data suggests that in low-income settings, breastfeeding declines with income. This point was made many years ago by an anthropologist friend of ours, George Ameligas, who pointed out that in poor countries, very often breastfeeding is associated with low-income activities. And so if income rises, women kind of stop breastfeeding or wean earlier. But in high-income settings, as income increases, breastfeeding is extended, duration extends. So this creates the possibility that the income elasticity of breastfeeding shifts over the course of development. And it would shift in ways which would counter Malthus's famous arguments about how as income increases, mortality declines. Because if in a poor context, if income's increasing, then in fact, duration of breastfeeding may fall. And if duration of breastfeeding falls, then infant mortality rises. So in fact, this contradicts Malthus's famous argument that mortality will decline as incomes increase. You might also be worrying about the opportunity costs, particularly as Camille brought up the fact that I've worked quite extensively on women's work over the course of my career. So how did women's work fit in with their historical activities of breastfeeding? And women's wages and the organization of the workplace are obviously very important things because women's wages were really the opportunity cost of breastfeeding. And the organization of work and workplaces can be more or less compatible with breastfeeding. And of course, we all know that one aspect of family-friendly policies is to try and make workplaces more breastfeeding compatible too. There are substitution possibilities, as I said. Wet nurses are a good substitute. Animal milk it was the historic substitute, particularly cow milk. And of course, in the 19th century, more recently, commercial formula. Other things that might help explain the rise and fall of breastfeeding are to do with medical advice, what your doctor tells you, what your midwife suggests, scientific advice, scientific knowledge about what breast milk is made up of relative to cow's milk. I mean, that was only really a discovery of the late 18th century. And And again, we have the pursuit of fertility, because if you actually are wanting to have another baby quickly, then in fact you will wean early because it's related to your fertility. Okay, so we in fact put together a lot of breastfeeding data, and we did this by looking first of all at the incidence, and that's the number of babies born. Well, some great demographers have given us lots of data on that, but we can't just go with the number of babies born, because we have to account for endogenous mortality, endogenous infant mortality. That's neonatal infant mortality, usually the deaths of babies between a week and a month, very, very early baby death. And those children are not likely to appear in our sources on the age at which babies were weaned. So we have to adjust for that. We have to take those children out. And also we have to take account of wet nursing, because in fact, wet nurses also are not going, they're part of the commercial economy. And what we're trying to get at is the value of unpaid breastfeeding. So we have 6 different kinds of sources here that are listed here for you on the duration of breastfeeding, and how old were children when they were weaned. And we've put together this data. It's not an easy task, and some of it really does need digging out. Some of it is quite entertaining. I've got one very lovely example from a sailor's autobiography, a guy called Joseph Robinson, and buried in the middle of his autobiography he's talking about his little brother Eddie, who was clearly a precocious little shit. But Eddie, he said, he was making fun of Eddie, and he said Eddie would insist on breastfeeding long after he should have given up, according to his brother. And this meant that one day he was standing up breastfeeding while his mother was doing the washing. She was at the wash tub. And some sailors were passing by, and they started to make fun of him for doing this. And so Eddie turned away from his mother's breast and shouted to the sailors, Eddie likes Tetty. Tetty's really good. So you then can put a weaning age on this little chap. You know, the fact that he could stand up when he was in the one, shout a rebuke back to the passing sailors. So we've got this kind of data then. We've also got data on bones, because you can actually, well, we can't, but bioarchaeologists can tell the age at weaning from the isotopes in rib collagen. So we've actually used data, bioarchaeological data here as well. Well, what we first of all do is we account for biases in each data generating source in each data representing process represented by our different sources. So we estimate the duration of breastfeeding by the source. We use maximum likelihood methods because these are interval censored observations by and large, and all sources exhibit positive bias relative to the public health surveys, which are our omitted category here. The residuals from this regression are then plotted against time to estimate we're using here we're using the residuals to estimate the time levels, the levels over time of the duration of breastfeeding. And we use local linear regression to do that. I'll show you the picture of that in a minute. And our local linear regression, if you're interested, has a bandwidth of 30, meaning it's a window of plus or minus 30 years on either side of the year to which the value at t is estimated. And it iterates then across all the time period to smooth the relationship. And this captures the mean residual duration after controlling for the time invariant source bias. So we're taking out the effects of the bias from the different sources, and then able to look over time at what was happening to the mean duration of breastfeeding. And we add to this time trend the constant estimated from that equation that's listed there. From the first equation, the equation of duration against sources. And this visualization, which I have to say, this is Lou's lovely picture, shows you the duration. And you can, since the constant is about 6 months, I think, something like that, you can see where it crosses this 0 line. These are the years when our estimate is about 6 months of breastfeeding. And you can see when it's above 0, then in fact, breastfeeding is lasting longer than 6 months. And when it dips below, breastfeeding is lasting less than 6 months. And you can see here the individual observations according to the particular source that we've controlled for in terms of its likely associated bias. So lots of lovely, oh, and the size of the balloon shows that towards the end of the time period, we've got a lot more observations, obviously, because we're drawing there on public health surveys, which give, a mass of observations. And some of this is easier to see if you look at this kind of picture, where you can see duration of breastfeeding in months drawn against real GDP per capita. And you can see what's happening to duration as the economy develops and GDP per capita increases. And we've put the years on this picture on the observations in this picture, so you can see what was happening over time in the same dimension here. So this shows you that from 1700, then in fact we've got a decline in duration of breastfeeding. So this is, and you might want to, if you're interested in women's work, you might then be thinking, oh yes, everybody thinks the 18th century was a high point for women's employment. So that might be what's driving that decline then in the duration of breastfeeding. And here, of course, from 1800, we get increases in the duration of breastfeeding. And again, you might be thinking, oh yes, that's when the census tells us women were retreating from the labor market, married women were retreating from the labor market, and probably devoting more time to work in the home. One of our reviewers is very keen that we check our findings against some other, perhaps rather more acceptable stories that could provide confirmation. And one is the birth interval story. So then we'd expect when the duration of breastfeeding is falling in the 18th century by and large, that would suggest shorter birth intervals because you're pushing away that lactational amenorrhea. And in fact, Wrigley does suggest that is an era when birth intervals are shortening. And the opposite is true from 1800 to 1900, when in fact we find birth intervals becoming longer as in fact breastfeeding was being extended. We also have looked for independent confirmation into the seasonal peaks in infant mortality, because a seasonal peak in the summer would be associated with reduced breastfeeding, because this would cause babies to be more likely to become ill from contaminated food, contaminated milk, and hot weather, of course, would lead to this kind of contamination and therefore illness and death. And what we do find is, in fact, that the seasonal peaks, certainly from 1700 to 1775, it looks like we're getting a movement in the seasonal peak in infant mortality away from a winter peak to a summer peak, which is consistent with, doesn't prove causality, I know, but it's consistent with that decline in the duration of breastfeeding. So that's the kind of independent evidence we're trying to work on here. This tells us about the prevalence then of breastfeeding. We know about the incidence, we know about the duration, or at least we think we know. We've put together a lot of evidence to convince ourselves and to convince others like you. But that doesn't tell us what the value is. We have to value human breastfeeding, unpaid breastfeeding, with reference to some market prices. And we do this, first of all, with milk prices, because historically cow's milk was the main substitute for mother's milk. And we assume babies need a gallon of milk a week. And we use Greg Clark's milk prices to cost this up over time. We can also look at wet nurses' wages. And there we use a series of women's wages that I've worked on with my colleague Jakob Weisdorf, and some later work by Sarah Horrell, my longtime co-author. So we've put together a series of women's wages, and we pay attention to what Valerie Files, who is in fact the historian in this area, what she says about wet nurses' wage premiums, because we wanted to argue that wet nurses were relatively well paid. And so if we were going to use a market imputation, we have to assume that the substitute for the mother's milk is relatively well paid. But in fact, of course, breastfeeding does not take a whole day. So that's the other side of this story. So we ended up just using married women's wages, which is provided in the series that Weisdorf and I constructed. And these two different approaches have a nice attribute that they represent upper and lower bounds, because the milk prices is going to be relatively conservative, very small. It doesn't capture the labor that's involved in breastfeeding. It only captures a kind of rough commodity substitute. But the women's wages will represent an upper bound on the value of breastfeeding. And this is the finding from that story. So you can see in the top part of the panel on the left-hand side, you can see that's our story about the value of breastfeeding as a percentage of GDP using women's wages as the imputation strategy. And the bottom line is using milk prices as the substitute commodity. And you can see here, since we've put in real GDP per capita in the bottom, it's on a log scale here, you can see that it doesn't just move with income. In fact, there are many other factors that seem to play a role here, and we have to take into account the fertility, the number of babies that is being born. We have to take into account whether women's wages or milk prices are rising in line with per capita income, or are they lagging behind, as they very often seem to do. We have to take into account whether GDP was growing quickly or slowly. And we've done this, in fact, on the other side of this panel here, where we tell you about why it is that we get this rise and fall in the value of breastfeeding relative to GDP. And a lot of this is about how rapidly GDP was growing relative to women's wages. We also, to return briefly to the point I made about how the income elasticity of breastfeeding might change over time, we can actually see this in this picture here, because as in the 18th century, we get this dramatic decline in breastfeeding with a small increase in GDP per head. So that's probably associated, that decline in breastfeeding would boost infant mortality. So what we're seeing in that part of the picture here, we're seeing a counteraction to a fact to Malthus's idea that when income increases, mortality declines. And that's then reversed when we look at the 19th century. So this is a really, and I think this is the first time, we think this is the first time that this kind of reversal of income elasticity in this way has been demonstrated, and how it challenges Malthus's mortality paradigm. All right, so conclusions. Well, what I've tried to argue then is that unpaid breastfeeding was economically significant relative to measured economic activity. Particularly, and this is important, you can compare this to sectors of the economy. So we looked at how valuable breastfeeding was. It never falls below 0.1, and it can rise to something like 5% of GDP. And so it's up there with important industries like pottery. It actually is larger than the whole government, historically, the government apparatus. So, you know, this is really an important component of economic activity. What's more, and this is again a kind of comment about externalities, its value massively exceeds what's spent on schooling historically, massively exceeds what's spent on apprenticeship in terms of apprenticeship premium. So it's the human capital investment of the past. And this was being done unpaid by women by and large. So this is a very important argument, I think, particularly given that in modern growth theory, all of you know if you're economists, huge emphasis is laid on human capital, the productivity of the next generation. And if that is supposed to increase, then breastfeeding here seems to be playing some kind of role. Accounting for unpaid breastfeeding and its imputed value modifies macroeconomic history of growth. It offsets that pre-1600s stagnation because if you remember, breastfeeding is relatively high in the medieval and Tudor period. And it dampens that era of Smithian growth after 1600 because we saw breastfeeding value actually declines in that time period. And this is the kind of thing that Colin Clark emphasized in that paper, although he uses very different methodology. And he's not talking about breastfeeding, he's talking about housework. But you have to see these activities and their movement back and forth across the production possibilities frontier, across the boundary with the measured economy. You have to see them as affecting how we understand periods of growth. I think the study also suggests a rather complicated relationship between the incidence of breastfeeding, particularly duration, and household income, and particularly also here women's contribution to household income, because higher household income reduces the value of maternal labor and therefore might encourage breastfeeding, but of course it has the opposite effect as far as an opportunity cost is concerned. One thing I think Lou and I are both agreed on, and that is that culture plays a role here. You might have noticed the rather beautiful stained glass that I showed in the PowerPoint, taken from Newcastle Cathedral. It's the only surviving fragment of medieval stained glass in Newcastle Cathedral. And it's part of a whole series of images of Mary breastfeeding the Christ child, which were in fact more or less eliminated with the Reformation. So this image of breastfeeding as a wholly a noble activity, which must have been seen by many ordinary women when they attended their churches, because it was a very common trope, a very common leitmotif of medieval churches. That disappears. So there are cultural factors here. And of course, there's education and information and misinformation. So Breastfeeding is not a biologically determined constant, but a dynamic, if neglected, part of economic life. Its value, as with other kinds of care, listed in that wider care docket that I showed you, cannot be reduced to private benefits. It does benefit babies and it benefits their mothers, but it also has important spillover effects that extend over time and across members of the society. Its value shouldn't only be thought of in instrumentalist terms. I've talked to you like an economist. I've said, okay, this is the value of breastfeeding. This is the value of housework. I could go on and tell you, this is the value, of laying out the dead. I actually am working on the value of laying out the dead. But these things were not just instrumental. They also do have a value in terms of their human dignity and the importance of personal interactions. But instrumental valuation is useful when you're talking to economists and when you want to influence policy and regulation. So historical analysis then underlines the value of care and how its providers contributed to economic and social progress, responding flexibly to changing needs and generating very significant positive externalities, substituting for absent public services and slow expansion, slow rollout of infrastructure, for instance, hygiene infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure, and building human capabilities so that the next generation could be more productive of adults. A historical perspective highlights the value of caring, and I think it warns against its neglect. And perhaps that's the message that I should leave you with, because we have to make sure that it's not neglected in the current set of interlocking crises that our society faces. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was actually even more stimulating than I anticipated. We're going to have probably 15 to 20 minutes Q&A. There's going to be a set of microphones. Yes, okay. And you just raise your hand so that we can get the microphones to you. While the microphone gets to Oriana, can I abuse the host privilege and start with one question that,
yes.
I couldn't help but, thinking about throughout your talk, which is a question about the future, actually. And I know,
historians, you definitely should ask historians about the future.
That's why I wanted to ask it. But there is this traditional view that the path to gender equality comes towards sharing. Here. It's about, men taking their fair share of a lot of the activities that you've listed. I take from what you've showed that actually it might not be so much about what we do differently, but how we value what we do. And I wanted to get a sense of how much you believe that we can actually already achieve a lot in terms of gender equality or path towards gender equality through this better valuation of the different tasks that men and women actually provide. And what would be the concrete steps, in particular for policymakers in doing so?
Of course, this is a very complicated question, and this is exactly what this work is reaching out to. There is a contribution in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy special issue by a guy called Jacques Chams. You probably know his work. He works on time use studies, and he's summarized all the very latest information on time use. And it's true that the gender division of labor in the home is becoming more equal. So one of the R's in terms of, the feminist demands here for recognition of unpaid work, redistribution, resource of unpaid, and representation, and reward. These are the R's that come out of, you know, the policy implications. And Jacques points out, yes, there is more equal sharing of activities in the home, but the equal sharing is of a certain kind. Men are preparing to do more childcare, and certainly more childcare that involves things like taking the children to football, or, you know, taking the children to art class. But cleaning the toilet, you probably think Humphries is just obsessed with his plumbing toilets, you know, but cleaning the toilet, or, you know, doing the routine housework, that's not changing. So you're finding that there is, in fact, still this kind of gender division going on within the home. And of course, we've got huge pressure on here too, because the demographics, rising female participation rates, along with increased elder care needs, this is really putting pressure on unpaid carers in the home. And we saw in the COVID pandemic how fragile reliance on women picking up, and it was women who, in the COVID pandemic, who did pick up most of, you know, the care that fell out of the commercialized economy back into the home. So, yeah, I think there's lots to be optimistic about. I'm not a pessimist. I'm like Tony Atkinson. He was always an optimist. You know, he always thought the world could be made into a better place. And I think I'm an optimist too, but we're not there yet.
Thank you. Oriana.
Hi, my name is Oriana. I'm a professor here in the department. So dovetailing to your point about sharing care, but what is not shared is the organization of the care. And that's not quantifiable either. So the total is way more than the sum of the parts if you think about it.
Yes.
Because which job has a component of teaching, a component of nursing, a component of
Yeah.
the logistics of it are never quantified.
Yeah.
And I think that that in itself can add to this number a fair bit. And most importantly, what I think is that it creates an artificial barrier between the world of work and the world of homework. Because often when women are finished, you know, when their kids go to school and they don't need to be home anymore, finding a job is very difficult because the experience that they've accumulated with the logistics, they basically have managerial experience that nobody has quantified.
Yep.
I was wondering whether you have any work on this. Thank you for the lecture, it was amazing.
I agree with everything you've said. I do think, I mean, but in some ways, this is what Nancy Folbury's been arguing for decades. You know, that when Jacques counts time use, you know, he counts childcare when you're actually doing something with the child. You know, you're changing its nappy or you're walking with it to school. But a lot of childcare, you know, is passive, as Susan Himmelwaite calls it. It's supervisory. And once you put that into the time use, it blows up, you know, the amount of care time and therefore the value of care. And so it's very important to remember that there's a lot of these kinds of activities. And in fact, this is very much the point that Claudia Golden makes. It's being on call, as she puts it, you know, that really is what deters employers from promoting women, certainly in the jobs that she's interested in. She's very much interested in white collar activities. And so being on call, having your priorities in the home is really what deters the advancement and promotion of women in those kind of sectors of the economy. So I agree with you that there's all these, makes it very difficult. But in the world I'm working in, my historical world, there's less of those kinds of problems, I think. But you made some good points, so.
Start kind of chronologically. There was a question right here on the left, and then we move a bit to the right as well.
Thank you very much, Jane. Judy Stevenson from the Bartlett. Very enjoyable and thought-provoking. I'm interested in that the response from the floor seems to be about inequalities between the genders today. But of course, what you're looking back at is a world where there's inequalities within the gender in terms of who would be putting out to wet nurses and who would not. Many of the people who came into even middle-class households or lower middle-class households as servants had very different rights to those who were giving over their children to be nursed. And I think Sonia Tikko has written a very interesting book about contract and coercion. But there's another element to that, which was coming into a household to perform functions like that gave you rights and respect within a class that you could have not touched before. So there's a bit of aspiration to that as well. And I wonder if you can comment about what happened between women contracting for care.
We haven't really dealt with this issue, but of course it is widely understood that women who very often became wet nurses, their own babies died. So there's a class issue right there that, wet nurses were actively recruited from lying in hospitals, particularly mothers of illegitimate children who were the throwaway children of the society. So you've definitely got this kind of class situation built in here. And I did talk about how the elite encouraged wet nursing for longer because they wanted to encourage fertility. So that's a set of issues there. I was going to make a point about differences between the genders because Misty Hegenas makes a very important point in some of her writing that actually it's not simply women having the burden of care, but that being carefree is actually a very privileged position. And being carefree means you have different opportunities, different options, different ways, different capabilities and functionings, Sen would say. You can live your life differently. And this, I think, is underlined by any analysis of caring labor. So, these are very interesting words: care, careworn, careless, carefree. Interesting set of verbal cues here about how we live our lives.
So, right, Anya, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jane. My name is Anya Plomin, and I'm at the Gender Studies Department. Two of your pieces are on my reading list, so it's a treat to see you here. And I wanted to pose a question that when you ended the talk about the counting of breastfeeding, you spoke about culture, you spoke about social progress, but the question is about the body of your work in terms of a normative judgment, but also judgment on the social progress and standards. When does that come in? Because we can have care that is at subsistence level and you can basically survive, or you can have the posh and plush kind of care, and we think about flourishing societies. So that even is coming up now with social care sector and workers providing 5 minutes per patient rather than a proper kind of care. So how do you deal with that very difficult problem in your work in accounting for a standard of care?
Look, this is a terribly difficult question, and I think anybody who works on care, whether it's historical or in terms of modern life, is pulled into questioning the paradigm of growth. So we're pulled into questioning, whether everything should be monetized, whether maybe everything, sorry, Lou, everything we've done, you know, is as dust in my mouth as I speak, because is it really what we should be about? You know, and that's why I did have it on a few slides. Is this instrumentalist approach appropriate? And then I in a cowardly fashion, I defended myself. Well, of course, if you're talking to economists, you have to take this route because this is how you affect policy and so on. But I think anybody who works on care, particularly actually if you work on it historically, you start to think, well, was that an improvement? Was that a gain? Who gained? Who lost? And it ties in with some of the other questions, like about, you know, the class situation around wet nursing. You know, one woman has the baby dies because she's selling her breasts to another baby. I used to love Dombey and Son. It was one of my favorite Dickens, but I can hardly bear the beginning now where, you know, little Dombey, the little boy Dombey his mother dies, and so they have to go out and find a wet nurse for him. And, you know, I've got too much of background here now, but I think it's really a very important question. I don't think I really have an answer except to say that I think we're all drawn into questioning whether or not many of the activities that, you know, we're costing up and we're saying this is important, this is valuable. And of course it ties in, as Jill Rubery would argue in her book, it ties in with all these other questions around, you know, the climate, the existential threat from the climate. Breastfeeding, by the way, is a very good ecological alternative to formula. You know, it passes the test there. Good.
Maybe a couple more questions.
Thank you. I found at the beginning fascinating when you kind of estimated how much difference this makes if you monetize all this care, unpaid care that's being given.
Yeah.
And I found it also interesting, you mentioned some attempts at satellite national accounts. And I think there's one for the environment, there's one for in France, there's one for tourism. The US had a satellite account for R&D, which I think they now put into their main accounts. And my question is a bit, is there any idea in terms of kind of significance how this correction in a way, or this satellite account would compare to some of those other things like the environment or the artistic capital or the other things I mentioned? And second, whether you think this is something that should go into our main national accounts, there should be a way to put this all into the official statistics. And if we would do that, if you think whether it would affect policy, whether if you would see it in the headline figure in the newspapers and everywhere, whether that would lead to changes in economic policy choices.
Yeah, I think this question relates to the earlier question. And there are two, I mean, some people think it really would be good to bring some of the material from the satellite accounts into mainstream SNA analysis, because it will focus the minds of policymakers on issues that, you know, slide out of their frame. Nancy Falbury says these accounts are called the satellite accounts, but of course, really they're the universe. And the GDP is like a little tiny bit of it. And I think the satellite accounts are important, but in many ways, they're token. You know, they're a token change. Okay, you can have your satellite accounts. You can do what you want over there. You can pay attention to the ecology. You can pay attention to gender differences, and then they do use the argument, Gerben, that if we started to import that into the SNA, it would lead to confusion. International comparisons would be very difficult to make. Policymakers wouldn't really understand, you know, what what GDP meant anymore. I don't know, Mary may have ideas in some of these because, you know, I know she's influenced several people who've written very effectively on the evolution of the SNA and why it doesn't move faster to embrace some of these issues. But as you know, services still are probably not very well integrated into national accounts. We still don't really have very good ways of measuring the productivity of services. We tend to measure the productivity of services by input prices, you know, and I can't answer your question because I'm A, not an expert on the satellite accounts, but B, I think I have very double standards about the satellite accounts. Like I also worry about the instrumentalist argument generally, overpowering what should really, you know, when we should really be thinking of how valuable these services, you know, it's just a standard story about economists, isn't it? You know, that they know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think that runs right through these debates. So not a very good answer, I'm afraid.
We're going to maybe take one last question. Lucky one.
But Gerben, I am working on adding all these values together and then telling a story about what happens overall.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. So my name is Cleo, I'm a historian of economics, and I have a question on the history of economic history. And it's a bit related to the other question, but in the context of the historical analysis. And so I just wonder if you see care as something that have changed the mainstream of economic history. Is it a satellite in economic history, or is it, you know, incorporated in some of the narrative, and did it change of view on the Industrial Revolution or things that are core to the field? How would you reflect on this?
Adam Smith says that a really vitally important activity is women's raising of children in the home. And he even gives a kind of time use dimension to this. He says, oh, that they need to work in the market as well because they need to contribute to household income. But they can only really manage to work in the market enough to support themselves. And the rest of the time they should be working in the home, looking after their children. And he even designs a women's education to optimize their ability to look after their children and make their children into more productive citizens. This is in The Wealth of Nations. So it's really, he recognizes this, but he limits the amount of time that women can do paid work by how much time. That's a residual for Adam Smith, how much time they can spend in the market. And, you know, if you read Steve Broadberry et al., their latest, you know, the standard macroeconomic history book at this point, for 6 centuries, they say, oh, women could only provide 30% of the days that are used in the economy. And that's constant over time. So the answer is, I think economists pay no attention to care. And I think economic historians have followed in the footsteps of economists and pay very little attention to care, apart from, you know, the feminist economists who I talked about, and, you know, 1 or 2 people who are interested in national income statistics, for instance. I mean, Colin Clark turns out to be an absolutely wonderful person on this topic. And there's a guy called Ari Halvilishin who wrote a very nice paper in the Review of Income and Wealth in 1976, where he looks at all the estimates that have been made of the value of housework relative to GDP for different countries and summarizes them. And, you know, some of the early national income accountants were distinctly uncomfortable about leaving aside. I mean, Colin Clark is a national income accountant, but he's very uncomfortable, as was, you know, many of the American early national income accountants. And some people, you know, argue Kuznets, the godfather of national income accounting. Kuznets was also uneasy about leaving to one side this very important sector of the economy.
Thank you. Sorry, we're going to bring this Q&A to a close. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight and attending this Atkinson lecture. There's going to be a small reception that you're welcome to attend next door. And I would like all of you to join me in thanking immensely Jane for a fantastic lecture tonight. Thank you.